Driver, start your engine! In the beginning, stock cars outran the police to deliver the hooch to our ancestors. So sweet. Are you ready for a trip down victory lane, where Richard Petty's winnings were insane and Dale Earnhardt put everyone to shame? Canadian Junior Hanley is in the Hall of Fame. Live from Haldeman County, it's time for the Driver in Deep podcast. Are you ready?
Hello and welcome everyone to the Driver in Deep podcast, brought to you by wingnutsports.com. I can't speak for you, Alex, but I've had quite the week, stuck in the house with this lockdown. However, the weather wasn't too bad, and we did get outside a bit and did a bunch of yard work to keep moving around.
Awesome. I can imagine if you've been doing some physical labor that you're probably feeling a little bit rough today.
Well, not really. I'm in prime physical condition, as you know. So I'm not.
Oh yeah, world-class disc golf player. I forgot.
That's right. So I'm not hurting whatsoever. However, that is true. I do sometimes tend to find others to do the physical work, and I do what I'm better at. And I'm not going to lie about that. So thanks, Darren, for all your help, big guy. Anyway, so how was your week?
Really a lot like yours, I guess. Really uneventful. We did some stuff around the house as well. And, besides that, I guess the most exciting thing was I was a witness to, I believe, 3 Maple Leaf wins this week.
Wow, you must be pretty happy.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think we're going to have to talk a little bit later with our upcoming guest about the 93 Bruins playoff series. I think they only played in one, and it was the first one, because there's a lesson to be learned here for you Leaf fans.
Yeah, well, our up-and-coming guest is a Leaf fan, so we'll see where that goes. We have had, over our short time in this podcast, we've had some great episode sponsors like Hunsinger Heating and Cooling, Cool Coolers, and of course, most recently, WeatherTech, among others, but we've still got plenty of opportunity for other great companies moving forward, whether they want to partner with us for one episode or multiple.
We're definitely always looking for great sponsors to work with. And if you're interested, please send us an email to wingnutsports@gmail.com.
All right, let's talk a little bit about our guest. He is a longtime hockey and motorsports announcer, and most of our listeners will remember him from the NASCAR Super Series days, or even at the start of the NASCAR Pinty Series. He is Ron St. Clair, and he is definitely one of the best.
Well, from what I understand, people like Ron, no matter what sport they're involved in, and you don't survive for 40 years without incredible commitment and tons of hard work and preparation. So I'm looking forward to speaking with Ron.
I agree, Mark. All right, let's head out west to Prince George, British Columbia, and bring in one of Canada's most well-known motorsports announcers and recent Canadian Motorsport Hall of Fame inductee, Ron St. Clair.
That sure sounded good.
Well, welcome, Ron, and congratulations being in the Canadian Motorsports Hall of Fame alongside Alex. What a great honor that must be.
Yeah, it truly is. And it was unexpected. I mean, I never set out to do this. It just kind of fell in my lap back in the 80s. And, it's just one of them things where if you have a passion for something and you apply that passion, good things happen. And it happened to me, and I'm super blessed that it happened. And, I couldn't have done it, obviously, without the guys like Alex and every one of the racers. I can't even name one because that would leave all the others out. They were all friends. It was like we were brothers on some of those tours and family. And it just all came together in the end, and it was such an honor. And, I'm just loving it.
Yeah, I agree, Ron. We'll get into some of those trips, but you're right. We're such a huge family going up and down the road. And, it's funny, hockey and racing always seems to cross when we're having one of our podcasts or one of our guests we had LP Dumoulin on last week and buddies with Patrice Brisebois and, just always, hockey guys too. And it just always seems like a natural fit. And, of course, you just held up that beautiful Toronto Maple Leaf Cup. And, everybody seems to be a Leaf fan too, except for Mark. Believe it or not, that poor bastard's a Sabres fan.
Yeah, well,
Well, he's close. He's just across the water.
That's right.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And plus, our fans fill his arena for him. So.
And
I might have to root for Seattle. I'm pretty close to them, but then all my friends here who are Canuck fans would disown me again. So I don't want that.
Time's a great healer.
Tough year for the Canucks too. And we're going to talk a little bit more about your Leafs coming up. I'm just going to give you a little teaser there. I got some advice for you Leaf fans.
Well, for me, it actually started with hockey. I know you want to talk hockey a little later, but when you talk about the career that I enjoyed, it actually started with hockey because that was my goal, to end up doing play-by-play in the National Hockey League. And somewhere along the way, I dropped the business card off at Delaware Speedway and said, hey, if you ever need an announcer, I have a little bit of experience. And that was back in 1988. And Shammy Palmer, which is Tony's daughter, Tony Novotny, called me and said that their announcer was ill and could I come out on a Friday night. And I hate to use the old cliche, but the rest is history. So while I was honing a hockey thing, it was perfect for stock car racing because it was play-by-play, essentially, and the ability to ad-lib under pressure and to be able to fill in those long caution flags and red flags. I had that kind of experience already on my resume, and it just so the hockey led to the success I enjoyed in stock car racing.
Yeah, I mentioned, Ron, at the start of this, how hockey and racing seem to always be a constant on this show. But more often than not, what always seems to be a constant also is the connection with some of our guests and the CASCAR Super Series. Looking back, I feel it's safe to say that Mr. Novotny was way ahead of his time. Can you tell us a bit more about Tony that maybe some people aren't aware of? I know, he's a pretty complicated guy, and I think he probably is getting his credit way too late for how great he was.
Well, he really was, Alex. He was brilliant, actually. He had a great mind for this. And I was very fortunate. As I mentioned, I ended up at Delaware Speedway in 1988 as the announcer. And, of course, Tony owned or was the promoter of Delaware Speedway at the time. And I was just in the right place at the right time. In 1990, General Tire was our series sponsor, and the Economic Times forced them to pull out. And Tony had approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in being the national marketing director for CASCAR at that time. And so I had the opportunity to drive up and down the 401 from London to Toronto countless times trying to secure deals in motorsports. And the first one that we had was Budweiser. And I have to tell you this story. It became the Budweiser Super Series, as you know. And we were driving down the highway to Toronto. And back then it was 90 or 91, I guess about 90. And we had an easel board presentation ready to go.
Nice.
And we get into the Labatt office, and Bill Vronsky was the head of Budweiser branding at the time. So we stood up on the easel board, and we're drawing out all our stuff. And we had a $200,000 proposal, and it included money for the drivers and the points fund and all that. So we went through everything, and it was through Tony's direction, that we were able to come up with this whole program. And Bill Vronsky got up after we were done, and he looks at the points fund, and he goes, what if I changed that from 50,000 to 200,000? And I looked at Tony out of the corner of my eye and I went, okay, we got something. We walked out of there that day with a deal pending for $1 million for that Budweiser series. It was a 2-year deal. So from there, Tony basically taught me the ropes of motorsports, the business side of it. And so I was able to secure all those decals around the fenders, the STP fastest lap, the NGK, whatever. And we had all those sponsors. And through Tony, on a trip to Toronto once, I said, what is your ultimate plan for this program? And he said, well, I'd really like it to be a national tour. And I said, I had lived out west in my broadcasting days earlier. And I said, well, I know 3 tracks right now. We could probably sign up. That was 1993. Louis Bennett, our tech director, and Tony and I jumped on a plane. I'm thinking 2 weeks later, flew out to Regina, Saskatoon, and then drove over to Calgary, signed up all three, and we had our very first tour out there. And so his vision of a national tour started to come together at that time. And when you talk about being ahead of the time, he had, you had to buy your tires from Tony, you had to buy carburetors, you had to buy all that stuff. And I know the drivers and the crew chiefs were not too happy about that at the time. But the truth of the matter is that money stayed in the circle, and we were able to pay some of it out. Yes, Tony did well, but it's his business.
And he had to.
It's your business. You're entitled to do that. But that money stayed in there, and we had lots of money in that program at one point. Not every driver would make, big money at every race. But in most cases, they all made something. And when you have 32 teams or 36 teams at a race, which we did back then, to be able to pay everybody something was just far beyond what was happening in Canadian motorsports at the time. So Tony was just so sharp. And some of the things he taught me, I was able to take with me when we opened the track in Vernon, as an example. And then I ran the West Car and the ARCA West Tour, and I was able to apply some of that out here. And they were small tours, just provincial tours, but there was money in their program for the first time ever. And it was because of stuff Tony taught me. So very sharp businessman, and he deserved every accolade he ever received.
Absolutely. It's like, I think we can all relate to this, racers or otherwise. We all, never thought our promoters or our series owners should make money, which is ridiculous. We think that they're just there to supply us with a place to race. But like you say, it's we all have to make money, and that's his business. And there's millions of other ones too now, which is the same way.
Well, I mean, for those who play hockey, we paid to play hockey. You want to go golfing? You pay to play golf. You want to go bowling? Name a sport. You want to go out on the lake and go motorboating? You've got to pay taxes. You've got to have a license, all that stuff. So everything had a cost. And I was just happy that we were able to put some back to the drivers, and never paid the bills, but that's where sponsorship helped out as well. And sponsorship was a fun thing in CASCAR because we were a replica of NASCAR essentially. And I can remember sitting in many corporate offices. I remember the Kerry Mix Murphy's potato chip deal. I sat in on that and helped. Mike Kerniak had SDP. Jim Maurice, our good old buddy Jimmy. He had deals. We went to Florida, as you know, New Smyrna Beach back in the 90s. And his deal, it was just small back then. It was like a $500 deal or something. But back then, that paid for the fuel or a couple of nights hotel for him to get to Florida. And his deal was simply they had to report back to the Windsor Star. And it was a three-way deal. We got money from the Windsor Star. We gave it to Jim, and Jim had to file reports that they could put in their paper. So it was that was creative stuff that Tony and I sat down and figured stuff out. It wasn't a lot of money, but everybody got a piece of the pie to help out.
Right.
Ron, I have to say, I've heard from so many of our guests that we've had on the podcast so far. They speak so fondly of the CASCAR series in those days. And I know that you must have been involved with a bunch of these hooligans driving up and down the highway, chasing this CASCAR series. And I'm sure, and let me just preface this with, I've heard stories from Alex's side, but you must also have some great stories about hanging out with these hooligans.
Well, I was King Hooligan. So, I was the leader of the pack a lot of times. Lots of stories come to mind. One for sure was our very first trip out west. I mentioned that Calgary, Saskatoon, Regina one. That was our first trip. So many of the wives didn't make that first trip. So can you imagine setting about 150 guys free on a Western road trip? We destroyed hotels. We all the old stories. It's true. And but the funny thing about that trip was we always went to the go-kart tracks wherever we were. And I think it was Wayne Dudgeon, broke an ankle, I think, that first trip out there. Somebody punted him into a wall or something. I'm not sure. But
then
we just had
a few years after that, Brad Jake's son, Terry, broke his arm at that track out there, too.
Oh, yeah.
Remind me never to travel with you guys.
I think fondly of Montreal. I remember one of the crewmates from Jim, geez, I'm just drawing a blank on his name. Number
Patrick.
15.
Patrick.
Yes, he was from Delaware. And one of his crew members, we were in a pub one night in Montreal, and I said, "See that lady over there?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "She keeps staring at you." And I talked him into going over to ask her for a dance finally. Of course, she wasn't staring at him at all, and she went over, and he got gunned right down.
I thought you were going to say the dance was on his lap.
Well, there were a few of them, I'm sure, over the years, too. Oh, I remember in Edmonton when we used to race at the road circuit in Edmonton, and one night after the race, I'm glad this isn't like normal TV where we can tell some of these stories. I remember John Fitzpatrick, who, of course, they had a great team, Donnie Thompson, JR, Johnny himself, and they won the race. Donnie Thompson won the race in Edmonton, so John opened up the pocketbook that night, and it was
It's
great,
pretty big, too, that pocketbook.
It was thick. Yeah, he could hardly sit down. And he opened up the pocketbook, and they had these great big 60s of Crown Royal, and I was the bartender. We moved the ladies right out of there, and she said, "You can't do that." "Oh, we're doing this anyway." I think he paid like $500 a bottle or something American. So it was, and I took over. I was a bartender. I remember there was guys rolling on the floor, scrapping by the end of the night. It was crazy stuff. But the off-track stuff, it's no different. Any sport, you go on a road trip, it's the same. Maybe not as fun, but same sort of things go on there too.
You know, Ron, I was hoping maybe you could give us a story about Alex, because so far none of our guests have been willing to go down that road. There's got to be a story in there.
Too clean, man. Too clean.
He was clean, and with Alex, we never hung out per se, and that's probably because you usually had your wife with you, and you were always well behaved. And
maybe my brother wasn't so much.
Well, that's another story, yes.
Yeah.
But what I remember the most about Alex was just the professionalism. I mean, I talked to every driver, interviewed them countless times, and Alex was just gracious in how he handled it. It was like you were a professional at everything that you did at the time.
Wow,
and you always gave me answers. I was always searching for gear ratios and stagger amounts and all that kind of stuff. And some guys would not give you the exact truth, and you were always very gracious and helpful, and you just came across with such a professional demeanor at all times. And I do remember when you entered CASCAR, and there was a big hoopla because you were having success in other venues. And I remember Tony saying, "Yeah, Alex Nagy's coming into the series," and I just remember the build up to it. I was excited. And, my job as the announcer was to make everybody's, at least I thought my job as the announcer was to make everybody's name a household name. The drivers were the stars of the show, and you didn't have to be a rocket scientist, or at least I figured that out early in my career, that it's all about the drivers. And I only wish that I'd been around long enough to make the crew chiefs as popular as they are nowadays with Cole Pearn and guys like that. But back then we were still just feeling our way out, and it was all about the driver and the teams and not so much about every individual. But Alex was a professional, and you were great to deal with at all times. And I think you guys fed me a few times, too, which always helped.
Oh, yeah.
If there was food, you would get extra mentions that night.
Well, I was on my best behavior, Ronnie, because I was broke, man, and I was so afraid to lose that GM deal that I was going to make sure I did everything else I could to keep it alive. And,
well, speaking of being broke, ultimately, I ended up out here in Prince George, and that's just a hockey thing. And a lot of people don't know this, but for the last 3 or 4 years of my CASCAR career, I commuted from Prince George every weekend, and it was brutal. I'd spend 70 cents to make $1, but it was my passion. I wanted to do it because I was so entrenched in CASCAR at the time that it just wouldn't seem right if I pulled out. So I went as long as I possibly could, flying red eyes over to Toronto every night and doing the TV shows and stuff. And I had to rely on teams. I know it wasn't intentional, but, we had Lou's Barbecue as a sponsor on teams and stuff like that. And everybody was so helpful. And even in Peterborough one night, I remember having a room given to me, and there was a prepaid bill at the restaurant, and yeah, just the guys and the gals were great. They took care of me, and my job was to take care of them, and I did. So I was broke many times during all of that too, but I often joked I was probably the only guy that did make money in that circuit.
Yeah, no kidding. So I was talking to a couple of our buddies this week leading up to this podcast, told them you were coming on, and talking about being broke and maybe a little bit frugal. I was talking to our old buddy Gibber, and he said, ask Ronnie about peanut butter and crackers for breakfast every time at the hotel. He said, I don't know if he was cheap or he just really loved them, but he seemed like that's what he'd like to have for breakfast instead of buying eggs.
Peanut butter and crackers for breakfast.
You don't even remember that?
No, that must have been the morning after.
Oh, maybe. Speaking of the morning after, I was talking to our buddy Mike Hollywood Herniak.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he said that he has a lot of stories, but not even on this podcast can they be talked about. But
well, we didn't see too many mornings after because we were up all night.
Yeah,
so.
He said to remind you, which I remember too, about the parties up on the hill at Delaware, and they lasted for about a day and a half. It seemed like.
Oh, it was just good times. I just want to, as I was telling the story about Peterborough, I just wanted to say Brian Cathcart who helped me out there, and he didn't owe me anything. And one day I don't know how he knew. But he knew I was down a little bit with the commuting, and he had that room for me and a restaurant bill paid for. And so I just want to take this time to thank him for that.
Yeah, he's you know what, Ronnie? He's still the same way. He's still helping guys out today. What a great guy he is. And so many of them for sure. And you touched on it. And I don't want to spend a bunch of time on this. I had a note here to talk about this, but you were way more than an announcer, man. You were involved in Sun Valley Speedway, all these sponsorship things. And you were the whole package, man. And, I can tell you that all of us drivers, I know there's going to be a bunch of us that are going to listen to this podcast and they're going to love it. But on behalf of them, I can tell you, we appreciated everything you did for us because you did a lot for us for sure.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll tell you a funny story about Bob Slack. We're at Cayuga. You were in this race, I remember. And I had already interviewed all the drivers. I came across the podium. I think we had 38 starters or something, and everybody got a word in. Back then, Tony kind of liked the fact that the drivers would introduce themselves. And so after that, I would, bring up the statistical part of their career and ask them a few more questions. And so I looked over, I'd interviewed all the dignitaries and everything, and including Bob Slack. And then we're standing on the start-finish line, and I said to him, I turned the microphone off for a second. I said, Mr. Slack, do you think it'd be okay if we gave the command to start the engines now? And he looks at his watch and he goes, son, it's 20-2. This is a 2:00 advertised start. Keep talking. That was a hard lesson. 20 more minutes. I'd already interviewed everybody. I should have told some Hollywood stories.
You should. Well, that would have filled some time in. But, there's another gentleman that was way ahead of his time, Mr. Slack.
He was great. Yeah. Another funny story, Delaware Speedway. Back then, of course, when we played our national anthem, it was done on a cassette. And we just have a tape recorder, and I'd put the microphone over the speaker, and that's how it was done back in those days. So one time I had it all queued up, ready to go, but I decided to go down to the infield area and grab another interview or something like that. Excuse me. And while I was down there, somebody must have come up into the booth, picked up a couple of papers, shuffled things around, put the cassette down upside down. Oh. And I never noticed. So I come up to and there's a big crowd. Delaware was full. It might have even been a McCurley Millen weekend or something back then. And I put the cassette in. I said, ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the Canadian National Anthem. And I'm in a glassed-in booth, so I can kind of hear, but not really loud. And so I play this thing, and it's not sounding like the Canadian National Anthem to me. And so I kind of lean over to where there was an opening in the window, and I had no clue what was playing. But there's one guy down. Everybody's looking up at the booth, wondering what the heck's going on. One guy down front's got his hat over his heart. I was playing the Bulgarian national anthem. So that was the only time in my career I thought, geez, I'm going to have to sing. But I didn't put him through that. I didn't put him through that. We just had so much fun. And, Skeeter Bedridge, he'll probably be listening. And I remember 2 victories from him, one at Delaware, one at Barrie. I don't think anybody celebrated more than Skeeter when he ran a race. I remember the one time he actually borrowed a vehicle from work. It was a Dodge truck, and he had motor problems, so he took the 360 out of the Dodge truck and threw it in his race car. A sad deal was Jimmy Patrick once went to Florida, and they had a great run down there. They won $1,000, I think, for winning one of the preliminary races or something. Then they get to Tech Lane. And unfortunately, a little bit of spray off the engine went into the intake. DQ'd, no $1,000. And I felt terrible. Another story about New Smyrna involved Don Malott. And they won a race. But this is a funny story because we were part of Speed Weeks. And I remember that on the Thursday, there was a big convention there at Daytona. And I was with Tony and Louie, and we went to this one booth, and the guy was showing everybody around how to shave weight out of a crankshaft. And Louie standing right, he's got his nose right in there looking what's going on. And he asked a question, and the guy said, wow, he said, especially those guys from Canada, Cascar, they don't know anything up there. He's talking to Tony and Louie. So that night, Don Malott he wins the race, and he's going to be DQ'd. And they want to look at the crankshaft. And Don's team was livid. They had a sponsorship commitment. They wanted to get out of there and go to the pub where their sponsor was. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, they weren't going to let anybody under that car until it cooled down. So 2 o'clock in the morning, everybody's gone. And there had been several libations consumed by then. And the only people left from Cascar were Louie, Tony. I was sitting in the pace car. And I was in there. Because it was getting nasty. And they crawled under there, and they had their light, and they were under there for 15 minutes feeling around. And finally they came out and congratulated them. But I thought that night, that was life-threatening, I thought, that night. Don was a fierce competitor, fierce.
Oh, yeah.
Great driver. Yeah, and one night in Toronto at Exhibition Stadium, it was a 50-50 format, and he led all the way. You might remember this, Alex. David Whitlock's hood was flapping in the breeze, and it finally came off, and went flying way up in the air. And as it was coming down, Don Malott swerved to the inside to avoid it. What he didn't see was Randy Latour, who was running second, snuck by him on the outside, final lap, beat him to the line by maybe 3 feet. I came down to the start-finish line with the microphone, headed off, leaned into the car to Don. I said, Don, you didn't win. And the look on his face, he couldn't believe it. Squealed his tires, took off out of there. And to this day, I don't think he believes that actually happened. But Randy Latour, the only race he ever won in Cascar, last lap Latour, they called him. And that night in the pit area, about a half an hour later, I stumbled in there. And Don, same thing, livid. And I thought my life was in jeopardy. And it was that night that I approached Tony Novotny. I said, that word official on the back of my jersey there, could I put UN in front of that for unofficial? And
or attach it with Velcro so you can take it off later on.
Yeah, that's right. But those were some of the funny things that happened, and it was all part of our building process and getting to know each other. But the rules were strict, and that's what made Cascar successful.
Absolutely, that was one of the highlights for sure. It was important,
yeah.
And we kind of got away from that, I think, a little bit in our sport. But I think we're getting back there again, where we understand that it's important to be strict and not think that you're giving people a break by not applying, not doing the rules properly. So yeah, that's a whole other podcast.
Well, you had to have it like that. And you know yourself, wherever we went, like the top 20 cars would be within 0.3 of a second or less. Like that's a blink of an eye. And it just made it so competitive. And it came down to you and the drivers, their skill level, because in theory, those cars were so close. And on those short tracks, you had to have skill. You had to have skill to race and win and stay up front and compete.
Well, hey, among other things like TV and see if I could compete with Steve Robley, one of the other reasons why I went to Cascar was just that. I knew I was going to get a fair shake, or at least I believed I did.
Steve was awesome, good friend to this day, and as most of the drivers are. And congratulations to Steve. Great to go into the hall with you and him in the same class. Excited.
And our old buddy Dowler. our old buddy.
Yeah.
Devin.
Oh, yeah. Kevin Dowler out there.
It's quite a group. Quite a group. I hope we can get to
Steve,
Toronto to celebrate that. That might take a couple days.
Yes, I'm booking a week off for that. Funny Steve Robley story. So it's 1990, first trip to New Smyrna Beach. And after the first week, there was lots of alcohol left. It was time to fly home the next day, but everybody still had a room full of alcohol, so they brought it all down to the hot tubs. And I don't know how many people were in the hot tubs down there that night, but Steve was in there, I was in there, a bunch of people. And about 6 o'clock in the morning, I said, "Holy crap." Steve says, "What?" I said, "We got to do an interview back in London on the radio station." And I said, "I promised that you would join us." And he goes, "That's okay." So up to the room we go. And we'd had a lot to drink. And this is a racing thing, right? So it's all fun. And I get on the air live interview at back then CJBK in London, I believe it was. And I said, "Steve Robley's with us here." And I said, "How was your week?" He goes, "Oh, it's good." That was it. One answer. I said, "And the car performed?" "Yeah, it's good too." And I asked about 6 questions, and the identical answer. It was good. Everything was good.
That's awesome. Oh, man, we could go on about that stuff, Ron, forever. We'll have to have you back on. We'll get some more stories together, but let's talk some more about hockey. I know that was a huge part of your career as well. So, I think you talked about, I don't know if you talked about how you got started in motorsports, but how did you get started in hockey? And obviously it was a great fit, right? Because of the 2 different seasons. So like you said, you could overlap, travel back and forth, and, all the great teams you worked for. But how did you get your start there?
Well, it was a great life. Like you say, hockey in the winter and motorsports in the summer, you can't go wrong. And believe it or not, Alex and Mark, this started when I was 8 years old and living in St. Mary's, Ontario, just outside of London there. And they would send me to bed. My parents would put me to bed about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock on Saturday night, but they'd leave the door half open and the hockey game on. So I'd be lying on the edge of my bunk bed listening to the hockey game, and something triggered in my head. I couldn't see the game, but I could hear it being described. And it was at that time that I decided I wanted to do play-by-play of hockey, 8 years old. And I pursued that with lots of English courses and things in high school. I took theater arts so that I could get in front of a crowd and act a little bit. And we had a broadcast course in London at HB Beale. I enrolled in that, was fortunate enough to get in. But then I found out they were teaching you how a camera works and stuff, and I wasn't interested in that, so I skipped out to play high school hockey and failed broadcasting. Then I applied to Radio
goalie,
Fan.
Right?
What's that?
You were a goalie, too. Kind of explains a bunch of stuff. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. Defenseman with no brains. And anyway, I went to Radio Fan Shop, and they gave me an aptitude test with 20 names on it. And I looked at it. I was 19 years old. I went, I don't know any of these guys. And the prof said, "Well, these are world politicians. How do you expect to be a broadcaster if you don't know any of them?" And I said, "Well, you didn't ask me how many goals Gordie Howe scored. I want to be a sportscaster." And he said, "Rejected. 35 people getting in this course. You're not one of them." So here I am, tail between my legs, 19, my career dreams dashed. But I was a groupie of a local radio station announcer, and he got me in, made a tape with me, and I went on to be a DJ right away in broadcasting. And that gave me the ability to ad lib. And so from there, I went to all across the country in broadcasting. And I ended up in a small place outside of Saskatoon called Rosetown. And a lot of my broadcast friends criticized me for going to this small town and everything. But you know what? I played senior A hockey, starting goaltender out there, or backup, I should say. I had no sense lying. I was backup. And I think I'm in the record book for the most goals against record or something. But anyway, my first hockey broadcast was a senior A game, and I was in full equipment, sitting in the grandstand, headphones on, doing a hockey broadcast. If Felix had got hurt in net, I would have had to go in and play, and I don't know how we would have done the broadcast, but that was my first hockey broadcast. So I got to learn how to do hockey where there were no listeners in a small community. And as luck would have it, Saskatoon International Raceway is a drag strip there, SIR, And somehow or another, I ended up meeting somebody and ended up announcing 2 years at that drag strip. So that was my first motorsport announcing. And we also did the 1984 World Junior Baseball Championship with Cuba and Chinese Taipei and Canada and the U.S. and all those countries. And so here I was in small town Saskatchewan doing big stuff that actually ended up really benefiting my career. And so the hockey, I ended up back in London and started with the London Knights. And my hometown, I have a great passion. One day I'm going to call them and say, I'm 60, whatever. I'd like to do one period and retire as a London Knight. That's my goal at this point. And from London, it went to Kingston. The coach and I, they had an ownership change in London, and the coach's contract wasn't honored. Neither was mine. And so he went to Kingston. I get a call later. Hey, we need a play-by-play guy. And I spent 7 wonderful years in Kingston. Just loved it there. And then from Kingston to, where did I go after that? Oh yeah, out to Vernon to operate the Vernon racetrack. And the owner at the time, money was a little bit of an issue, and that track ran into
beautiful
some
place he built.
What's that?
It was a beautiful place.
Oh, it was a great track from the starter stand down. When I first got there, it was a Cascar West race. They flew me in August of 2000. And there were 7,000 people in the grandstands, and the track was incredible. 22 Cascar West machines ready to battle. And I announced that show, and right after the show, Gary Hammond said, I'd like you to run this track. We had I thought the top 3 track in the country from the starter's stand down. But unfortunately, we had, no grandstands. We had no concessions or washrooms. So they were all rental that first year. And one time on a Thursday night, I called out to the track. We had a security guard there, and I said, what's going on tonight? And he says, well, I'm just watching the sheriff take the seats out of turn 4. And I went, what? He says, yeah, they got a truck backed up here. They're taking all the seats out. So I called the owner. I said, what's going on? Well, check's in the mail, and they're taking the seats out. I said, well, we got a $10,000 super late modified show coming in Saturday night. I'm paying $10,000 for that show. I need those seats. Why didn't you think that was important? Well, we just didn't think it was important to call you. And so the next morning, I had to go into the radio station and digitally edit the last 5 seconds of our radio commercials and said, and don't forget to bring your lawn chairs for the all-new lawn chair section. So we made it work, but it was a tough deal. You have to think on your feet pretty quick, and especially as the announcer. Like, look how many red flags and cautions and stuff, right? And I learned early to always be prepared. I had dozens of interviews on my tape recorder ready to go. And it paid dividends one night in hockey for me when we hosted the Royal Bank Cup out here in Prince George, which is the Tier 2 Junior A. One step down from the London Knights and such. And the Prince George Spruce Kings were hosting it. And they went into the semifinal game against Canmore, Alberta, 5 overtimes. It was the 4th longest game in the history of hockey at the time. It was 2007. And because of my motorsport experience with caution flags and red flags, I never missed a beat for 4 additional intermissions we had to fill. So it came around full circle.
Ron, I have to say, hearing your story about how what got you into broadcasting really resonated with me, because myself, I grew up in St. Catharines, and Alex has heard this story before. Yeah. I remember the same sort of situation. I was supposed to be in bed, and, my mom come in and tuck me in. And back in those days, we had a rec room downstairs, and my dad would have the hockey game on. And I'd be lying in bed, and, I tried putting my ear to the floor so I could hear it. But, that was kind of my experience. And over the years, because we lived in St. Catharines, that's how I started being a Sabres fan and listening to Rick Jenneret on the radio over all these years, almost my whole lifetime, and the French Connection and so on. That's how I started to love hockey, was through the words of Rick Jenneret. And I understand that you're a huge fan of Foster Hewitt, and how could you not be? I mean, he's a legend, and there's a broadcasting award in his name. Can you tell us a little bit about your memories of Foster Hewitt as a broadcaster? And do you have a favorite Foster Hewitt hockey call? And I mean, I know there's one obvious one here. How about putting you on the spot? Would you be willing to impersonate and give us a little call there?
Well, two come to mind. The first one was his very first ever broadcast way back in like 100 years ago now. And he was in a phone booth at the Mutual Street Arena in Toronto on a phone calling the game. So a lot didn't change over the years.
Wow.
And he said, and I sure hope you can hear us as we've had technical difficulties. And then in 1972, of course, that was the game. That was the year that, every Canadian remembers that goal by Paul Henderson, and I have a great Henderson story. But anyway, Foster Hewitt couldn't say Yvonne Cornwallis very well. He couldn't get that down. And in the tournament, he goes, and the Canadians are led there by Yvonne Cornwallis. Oh, forget it. Maltsev has scored for the Soviets. And by the end of the tournament, he had it down, Cornwallis. And he was so proud of himself at that. And Foster was the first. I didn't think he was the greatest. I thought Danny Gallivan was the greatest, Montreal Canadiens. He'd have you on the edge of your seats. And all that was happening was Montreal was regrouping behind their net. He'd go, now the Canadians. And it's just lining up behind the net. And he'd have the right out in front and a sizzling shot there. And I loved him. And, Danny Gallivan. But back to Paul Henderson. Of course, he gave the Henderson has scored for Canada. But Paul Henderson came to Prince George, and he was going to speak at the university here, and they asked me to MC the show. I went, wow, me. So I get up there. There's about 500 people in attendance, and I said, Paul Henderson sitting down to my right, and I said, I can't believe this. Childhood hero, and he's right here, and I'm the MC. Why'd they pick me? But, you know, the more I think about it, the more Paul Henderson and I have a lot in common. Like, he used to play for the Leafs, and I'm a huge Leaf fan, so obviously we had to learn how to play golf at an early age. And I said,
don't give Mark that fuel.
A lot of people don't know this, but true story. Paul Henderson was born on a sleigh on the way to the hospital in Kincardine, Ontario. And I was conceived at my mom's grade 12 toboggan party. So kind of. Of course, that's not true. Mom went to her grave hating me for that one. Rest her soul. Hockey, another one for you, away from Paul Henderson, and a different Paul. I think it's Paul Morris. Alex, you might know at Old Maple Leaf Gardens.
Yeah, he was the rink announcer. Yeah. Yes,
that's right. So it seems growing up, everything was at 4:19 seemed to be the time of everything. He'd go, Toronto goal scored by number 27, Daryl Schittler. Correction, that's number 27, Daryl Schittler. And then you go, the time 4:19. And everything was 4:19. Leaf penalty to number 7, Tim Horton. The time 4:19. And one time he says, and don't forget, hockey fans, there's WWF Wrestling this Tuesday night at Maple Leaf Gardens. See Whipper Billy Watson tango with Gene Kiniski, and a live bear takes on Bruno Bully. The time 4:19. How could that be? But and one time I was at CHL Top Prospects game, and that was Joe Thornton, Roberto Luongo, Patrick Marleau, who just entered the NHL record books. And their scrimmage in the morning was over, and I was going to call the game that night at Maple Leaf Gardens, my first and ever time that I called a game.
Let me guess, it was April 19th.
Yeah, the pregame was 4:19. And anyway, so who's standing there but Bobby Orr? And I'm outside the Leaf dressing room, or the other side actually, and I got to interview Bobby Orr. It was the first time I interviewed him. He was a player agent at the time. But the penalty box door was open, and the building's empty except for parents and scouts. And I said to Bobby, watch this. And I walked over, and I hit the microphone, boop, over the PA system. So I knew I was on. And I go, Boston goal scored by number 4, Bobby Orr. The time 4:19. Anyway, it was kind of cool to hear that over the big system and everything, and it sounded just like it at the time.
Awesome. There's so many great announcers over the years. We were just speaking about Rick Jeanneret as well, and he won the Foster Hewitt Broadcast Award and was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, I think, in 2012. And for me, there's so many great Rick Jenneret calls to choose from. And Alex, I know this is probably going to hurt. You probably
whatever.
remember the La Fontaine ones,
Yeah.
or he's also the one who coined the phrase "top shelf" or "Mama hides a cookies." If you remember
Mayday,
that.
Mayday.
We're going to get to that, and so roll the highlight film, I guess you'd say. Let's take you back to 1993. Buffalo and Boston were playing. I think it was a first round, and the Sabres had lost, I think, the last 7 regular season games coming into the playoffs, and Boston had won 17 of their last 20. And the Sabres were 23 points behind Boston. Nobody was giving them a chance. But somehow, Buffalo found themselves up 3-0 in the series with a chance to sweep the Bruins at home. It was Game 4 was in Buffalo, and the Sabres were down 5-3. And they fought back, and believe me, you haven't heard loud unless you heard the crowd when Yuri Himalev tied the game up halfway through the third period. Do you remember him at all, Alex?
No.
No, you don't. Okay.
I wasn't even born in 93, buddy.
Well, yeah. Well, all I'm going to say is this. In overtime, it got even louder. There was a breakout play. Doug Bodger, I think, sent a pass up to LaFontaine, who was in the process of getting tripped up. And then while falling down, he passed the puck up to Brad May, who put one of the greatest moves you'll ever see between the legs of Hall of Fame defenseman Ray Bourque. And then May puts on an equally great move on Andy Moog to score, and the Sabres swept the Bruins.
Are you going to call it?
You want me to call it?
Sure.
I think I probably could. All right. Well, let me see what I can do, and it won't give it any justice here. Okay, here we go. All right. Moving it up to LaFontaine. He gets tripped up, gets it to May. In over the line. Here's May going in on goal. He shoots. He scores! Mayday! 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 Brad May wins it in overtime.
Look like you got some competition, Ronnie.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm not trying to help the Leaf fans or anything. Until they win something, they haven't. So you shouldn't take anything for granted is what I'm saying here, or you might find yourselves like Boston did in the 93 playoffs.
Well, that was very good.
We have found ourselves in that position, right, Ron?
Yeah, oh, yes. Yeah. Well, it was a great career. It was the drivers, it was the hockey players. I mean, I did over 2,000 major stock car races in my career, over 2,000 hockey broadcasts. That probably means about 10 to 12,000 interviews. And to be honest with you, I probably only used about 4,000 of them on the air, but the rest was knowledge. Yeah. And so you had that in your mind. So if I did an interview with Alex as an example, and we didn't have enough caution flags that your interview had actually aired, I still had the knowledge of the stuff that you told me. So when we did have a little break in the action, I was able to fill it in for the spectators. And just on that note, I want to say, as we blazed the trail with CASCAR, the one thing I always found odd, and I want to thank Dave Mathers for this, another Hall of Famer and a Facebook friend of mine and many people. He taught me, he doesn't even know this, so this is a first, Dave. When I first started at Delaware Speedway, Dave Mathers had a stopwatch, and he could stand there and talk to everybody, but he knew how fast everybody was. And I picked up on that. Nobody had to tell me. It just came naturally. I bought a stopwatch. It was my only piece of equipment I had, stopwatch. And I'd be in the infield area talking to everybody just like Dave used to. And I could go over to Alex's pit and say, hey, you ran a 20.53 in your first practice, 20.29 second. What'd you do differently? And he taught me that without knowing it. And I took that with me. And what surprised me the most is of all the tracks that we went to, I never saw another announcer ever with a stopwatch. Ever. And I couldn't believe that. And there were many places we went to where when the caution flag came out, up came the music. And I never could figure that one out either. To me, that was money time. That's where you sell your hot dogs, your hamburgers, your hot dogs, your series, your sponsors, everything. And all that just, nobody had to teach you that. That just came naturally. And I think of the ACT tour and curling. Tom Curley. This is when I knew that we were onto something. And from a personal perspective, I knew that something was good there too, because we were at Motorsport on the Oval, and we were on the same tour as ACT. We were in Budweiser tour together. And when our show was on, I think we were doing a last chance qualifier on a Saturday night or something of that nature. And he was in the booth. And it was intimidating. Tom Curley standing behind me in the booth listening to every word. And I didn't quite understand it, because it was very intimidating. But I'd say something, and I would see him on the reflection of the glass making notes. And I remember saying at the time that it was the $400,000 cash car Budweiser Super Series. That's how much money we had in the coffers for drivers. The next day, Dave Moody came out with the $1 million ACT Tour. And I knew then we were on to something. With Tom Curley taking notes, we were on to something. Yeah. So there were a lot of good moments like that. Tom was at Delaware Speedway, and they were racing one night, and the lights went out. And we were sponsored by Budweiser again. And I just happened to have the microphone when the light came back on. I said a Bud Light. he thought that was pretty fun. Okay, do I have time for a quick lights out story?
Sure do.
Sure.
Brad Jakes, Delaware Speedway. Love Brad. Class act. Great driver. Used to drive the Walker Dynamax car. And then, of course, he had the number 99 car. Anyway, one night the lights went out at Delaware. And Brad had been black flagged or moved over or something during the race. And it was black except for a couple of little lights that were on generators and everything. And all of a sudden, the lights came back up. I'm still on the microphone. And there's Brad Jakes halfway up the starter stand. He got out of the car and was halfway up the starter stand when the lights came back on. And gosh, that was a funny night. I don't remember whatever happened to him that night.
He was a big dude too, man. He's a big dude.
Yeah. Those were good times.
And,
a lot of stories.
Yeah. Before we cut you loose, Ron, you mentioned about Dave Mathers. Great guy.
Yeah.
And you talked earlier about me coming from Flamborough and bit of a splash, and I'm going to Delaware on Friday nights, me and Big Sam trying to get our feet wet and learn those cars, and we were 5th, 6th, 7th on a Friday night or something, and used to winning, so it was disappointing. And Mathers come over to me one day and he said, "Nagy, this isn't Flamborough, a little tougher over here." So he doesn't know it either, but man, he motivated me, and that's all I needed to hear. And soon enough, after that, we won our first Friday night feature and went on to start fortunately winning some Super Series events. So yeah, no, great guy. And I don't mean nothing negative about it, because it motivated me for sure. He was basically telling me he can't make it happen in CASCAR.
Well, I know Mike Hernick just recently changed the page on CASCAR to include Dan Shirtliff, who also ran the GM Goodwrench Chevrolet, and you and Kelly Williams were all sponsored by them. And I loved Kelly. She did so much for the series. And one time at Cayuga, when you guys are driving in packs like that, everything's relevant. You all look the same speed. When you're inside the car, you can probably look over and do one of these because you're right beside them. But as a spectator, you knew they were going fast, but you didn't know how fast until one day at Cayuga, Kelly got pushed to the inside onto the grass or something like that, and she hit a little piece of asphalt or something in the grass area there and actually went airborne for a little while. And that's when I went, "Oh my God, are they moving?" When you're on the asphalt, you guys are in a pack. They look fast, but when she left the ground and flew through the air, you could actually see how fast you guys were traveling there. And it got quicker at other tracks. So hats off. We all wanted to be drivers, but we couldn't. And the good Lord chose me to be the announcer, and I'm gracious and thankful for that. And you guys were the stars of the show, and I wouldn't change anything. I wouldn't change a thing in my career. I loved every moment of it, and I had so much passion, and I'm so flattered and honored to be going into the Canadian Motorsports Hall of Fame with you, Steve, Kevin, and all the other greats that are in there.
Me as well, Ron. And I can tell you, I said it earlier, we are super happy that you became our announcer, because you helped us a lot, and you helped our sponsors become happier. So it's been awesome to have you on, man. And we'll have to have you on again down the road,
For
because
sure.
We've just touched it. You and I both know that. And,
Yeah.
But
It's been my pleasure.
Appreciate you coming on. Best of luck out in the British Columbia, and say hi to everybody out there for us. And we look forward to having you again.
All the best, Ron.
Going fishing. Going fishing today.
Awesome.
Attaboy. See you, Ron.
All right. Have a
Take
good
care.
one. Take care.
Thanks, Mark.
There he is, everybody. Ron St. Clair. Thanks again, Ron, for coming on. Please tell our guests and our listeners, Mark, once again, how they can support us.
Sure, Alex. We always tell you to head to our Facebook page by simply searching Wingnut Sports. But of course, we're also on Instagram and Twitter. Just look for us at Wingnut Sports and go to our website, wingnutsports.com. And if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of your other podcast platforms, please take a second to like our podcast. We'd really appreciate it. And if you go to wingnutsports.com, be sure to check out our show notes. That's where we have links for the whole conversation we just had here today, and also all the links for not just our own, but our guests' social media information.
Yeah, the show notes there's a ton of great info there. So definitely, hopefully everybody gets a chance to visit that. This has been the Driver in Deep podcast with your hosts, Mark and Alex. Hope you enjoyed it and have a fantastic weekend, everybody.
Mayday.
Well, we're wide open sideways.
All right, you're clear.
Talk is